It has been a long journey for many of us waiting to walk into the land of shadow, but that time is now here. After 2 years of playing Elden Ring's base game and 2,000 hours, I learned a lot about my favorite game. I learned the terms broken and overpowered simply by learning how to build. I memorized every talisman and buff in the game to allow myself to create fun and strong builds I love. I held on to every reason to keep playing what has become my favorite game ever, and there's nothing that even comes close. The moment is here for all of us, and we were giving a DLC that somehow exceeded our expectations, but there was one lingering question I've had: what is the best build in Elden Ring? Well, 2 years later, the answer is still complex. Now it seems to be made more so with the addition of the amazing Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, giving us even more options to ponder over. Finally though, I had decided on the best build for the base game and the best new build for Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree. In this video, we'll cover some of my favorites along the way, new and old, and dive into the best build for Elden Ring and its DLC. Later in this video, I'm even going to show you how to craft your own builds. I've done a series on that. I've taken that further. We're going to craft a really cool Milady build. What is the best build in Elden Ring? Let's jump in. In order to do this, first we're going to have to jump into my top 3 base game builds. At number 3 we have Night Comet. This one was tough for me, but since these are all rune level 150 builds, this one falls from the first 2 spots to 3. Night Comet is phenomenal, doing massive damage and being chargeable, all while being a spell bosses, NPC invaders, and mobs can't see. It's truly an incredible spell. The Staff of Loss also boosts this by 30%, and when you have 2 Staves of Loss, that is a 60% boost to an already broken spell. Night Comet absolutely deserves to be in the top 3, even if it's better as you level up towards rune level 200. Interestingly, at max level, the Prince of Death staff will still give you 2 to 3% less damage than the Staff of Loss when you're using 2, all due to the extreme boost it gets. However, it is best on its own at 99 intelligence. Honorable mention in the Dark Moon Greatsword, by the way, which would be in my number 4 spot. We were going to jump into equipment and stats. For equipment, we have 2 Staves of Loss, plus 25 on the one you're casting with, any seal for buffs, Godfrey Icon, Magic Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Graven Mask Talisman, Magic Tier, Faith Tier. So this one's a little hard to hit 60 Vigor for, so we went for 50 Vigor, 70 Intelligence, 33 Faith with the Faith Tier. We're using Terra Magica, Night Comet, Golden Vow, and Halshaburi. At the number 2 spot, I have the Scavenger Curved Swords. If you're at rune level 125 to 150, these are incredible. On Occult, you get a little less bleed, but insane physical damage and DPS. If you're closer to level 200, the Beastman Curved Swords, Gargoyle Twin Blades, and Bandit Curved Swords are all better. At max level, the Bandit Curved Swords have the highest AR for any curved sword in Blood in the game. Back at rune level 150 though, the Scavengers are truly amazing. You'll end up loving them simply for only having to invest points in 1 damage stat, allowing you to keep 60 Vigor and good endurance too. These are truly amazing for meta bleed. We have 2 Scavenger Curved Swords on Occult with Seppuku. Of course we have the Dragon Communion Seal. You're going to need the White Mask, Raptor's Black Feathers. Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Claw Talisman, Millicent's Prosthesis, and then you have the Thorny Tier and Faith Tier 2. If you don't have Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, you can run Millicent's Prosthesis and regular Wing Sword Insignia. And for stats here, you can see it's easy to keep 60 Vigor, 28 Endurance, we have 75 Arcane, that's our main damage stat right there. You don't need a lot of Mind for this build, you're just using Seppuku, we're using Golden Vow and Flame Grim Strength. For the base game, the number 1 build of old is the Blasphemous Blade. We're going to make our decisions and comparisons between this and our top Shadow of the Erdtree build later in the video. For now, let's talk about the Blasphemous Blade. It was an amazing weapon that did some poise damage, knockback, and massive fire damage, all while healing you. I mean, there's broke and then there's easy mode. This is the latter. Recently, they patched the knockback as well as the poise damage on the Blasphemous Blade. However, the Ash still does massive fire damage, still heals you, and pulls directly from your Fate stat. This essentially gives you 1 damage stat, and a very good one at that, to unleash havoc on tough bosses and enemies. The Blasphemous Blade is truly an amazing weapon, one of the best in any Souls game. Which is why it remains in the top spot for the base game despite the recent nerfs. When a problem with the weapon is that it's boring or it's too easy, how can it not make the top spot? The Blasphemous Blade is truly a phenomenal weapon and really can make the game significantly easier. Now that we talked about the base game, it's going to be time here soon to talk about Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree, which is going to be a much more difficult task and a newer one at that. Of course, before that though, we're going to go over the build for this one, equipment, stats, and everything you need to know for the Blasphemous Blade we used to use on the base game. Build, believe it or not, has actually improved. We're going to talk about that later in the video too. We're going to go over that. For the base build here, we have the Blasphemous Blade plus 10. We have any seal for buffs. We have 51 poise here. And we have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. We have the Fire Scorpion Charm. We have the Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman. We have the Flame tier and Faith tier 2. And of course, Mimic, which we're going to go over later as well. Let's talk about stats. All right, our stats here are 60 Vigor, 24 Mind, 25 Endurance. We have 22 Strength, 75 Faith with the Faith tier. We are using Golden Vow, Blessings of the Erdtree, and Flame Grant Strength. Before we go into my top 3 that won't be nerfed, I want to talk about the ones that will be. Now, the Perfumes, the new Thorn Sorcery, and Bloodfiend's Arm are all likely to be hit with nerfs, and honestly, right now, they're doing broken levels of damage. This weapon specifically does extra bleed on the charge hits while also doing massive posture damage. It is an incredible strength and arcane weapon and easily would make the top 1 spot, honestly, tied with the Perfumes and the new Thorn Sorcery if it weren't for the fact that it's incredibly likely to be nerfed and tuned down a bit. So I'm putting it in the honorable mentions category, and we are going to jump into equipment and stats for this build. We have Bloodfiend's Arm in Blood Affinity with Savage Lion's Claw. We're using the Dragon Communion Seal. We hit 51 poise. We have the Shard of Alexander. We have the Two-Handed Sword Talisman, Axe Talisman, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Spike Crack tier, Faith tier. We're using Market Shackle there as well. Let's jump into stats. For our Broken Strength and Arcane build, we have 60 Vigor, 18 Mind, 28 Endurance. You're going to need a decent amount of Endurance, by the way. The weapon is rather heavy. We have 40 Strength. That's going to be 60 when you two-hand it with the 1.5 times Strength bonus. 45 Arcane, 25 Faith with the Faith tier, Golden Vow, Flame Grant Strength. Now for the number 3 spot in the Shadow of the Erdtree builds, we have Night Claws. These are actually amazing. They have a really cool Ash of War. Unfortunately, though, they are a somber weapon, so you can't really increase the bleed buildup or really buff them with any greases or anything like that. Bloodhound's Fang is one of the few outliers where you can do that. This definitely makes it in the top 3, though. Great Ash of War. And with really good range and a lot of bleed buildup on the Ash. But again, you can't really buff this with anything or change the affinity too much. However, this Ash of War can be found, I believe, in Shadow of the Erdtree. We have the Claws of Night plus 10. We have any seal for buffs. We have 51 poise, 61 here. We have the Shard of Alexander, Wingsword Insignia, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Millicent's Prosthesis, Thorny tier, and the Faith tier 2. Now, on the Ash, you can get Lord of Blood's Exaltation to proc. Now, for the successive hits, you're going to want to get up close and do your regular light attacks. We have 60 Vigor, 80 Dexterity for this one. It scales mainly and pretty much only with Dexterity. We have 25 Faith with the Faith tier. This also does magic damage, by the way, but it seems to just be weapon level, and maybe it scales with Dexterity. I'm not sure what the scaling is on the magic part of this. I haven't tested that part of it specifically, but overall, these are probably the best claws in the game. I just wish they were a regular weapon where we could change affinities. We're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Strength here. Okay, for the second build here, we have one that is loved by many players at this point, and that is the Fire Knight's Greatsword, and that is for good reason. This is a phenomenal weapon in the DLC. No question, one of the best weapons, and it scales with a B in Flame Art and Sacred as well. If you put Flame Skewer on it, it will give you, I think, around 950 AR in total, which is incredible. And then, of course, you get a follow-up attack if you're able to pull it off. I wasn't able to pull it off there, too, as well with the right trigger. So the reason that this makes the number 2 spot not the number 1 spot for me, despite the fact that it is a pretty phenomenal weapon to build around, is that the number 1 spot on this list, for me personally, actually carried me through a good portion of the DLC. I can't say the same about the Fire Knight's Greatsword yet, but I will say it is a very good colossal weapon. And as somebody that enjoyed Faith, I picked this one up pretty early and did enjoy it. Now, we have the Fire Knight's Greatsword in Flame Art with Flame Skewer on it. We have any seal for buffs. We did hit 51 poise. We're using part of the Fire Knight set here. Shard of Alexander, Millicent's Prosthesis, Fire Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Flame tier, and Faith tier 2. All right, we're going to jump into stats for this one. You're going to need some decent requirements. So Millicent's Prosthesis was to hit the Dexterity requirements. I have 70 Faith with the Faith here because we are in Flame Art. We're getting around 950 AR, which is really incredible. This is really a great sword, so to speak. We have 60 Vigor, 25 Mind, 29 Endurance. Of course, you're going to need a decent amount of Endurance for this one, too, as it could be a little bit weighty, but again, this is a really strong sword with a lot of AR, a lot of potential here, especially for Faith builds. I really like this one on the number 2 spot. We're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Strength too. At number 1, we have the amazing Backhand Blades. These weapons are the definition of reliable, being both powerful and fast. They can hit hard, they have good scaling in most affinities, including a B in Flame Art, by the way, and allow you to dodge incoming attacks and follow up with your own attack. These were instantly amazing the minute I built around them in DLC, and honestly, it's been hard to put them down. I felt like there were many moments in the DLC that this weapon carried me, and if you give them to Mimic and use summons, he's great with them too. The backhand blades were a fantastic addition to Elden Ring, and I love how simple and effective they are. If you haven't picked these weapons up yet, pick them up in the DLC. You can get them really early. They truly are a phenomenal weapon. I have nothing really better in the DLC that I can recommend so far better than the backhand blades. I've truly had a very, very easy time with these. They are absolutely ridiculously good in pretty much all affinities, by the way. I love the backhand blades. Solid addition that Shadow of the Erdtree brought. Good in the base game as well, too. I've used pretty much all the best stuff in DLC at this point, at least getting around to it. These are incredible. Blood backhand blades, plus 25 preferably. Any seal for buffs, we have 51 poise. Shard of Alexander, Winged Sword Insignia, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Malignant's Prosthesis. We have the Thorny tier, Faith tier, and we're using Market Shackle there as well to stun the boss. Alright, and for stats on this one, we have 60 Vigor, only 19 Mind, don't need too much of it here. We have 26 Endurance, we have 45 Dexterity with Malignant's Prosthesis, we have 45 Arcane, that's for the soft cap and the bleed build up there. 25 Faith with the Faith tier, of course, only 15 Strength. Don't forget, in a little bit, we're going to show you how to create a build too, a cool DLC build. We're using Golden Bow and Flame Grant Strength. And here we are, trying to figure out what is truly the best build in the game with DLC out, removing the insanely broken stuff that will get fixed. I've concluded, Shadow of the Erdtree's weapons do not compare well to the base game. This could simply be because many of us are still learning them, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Still, to this day, the Blasphemous Blade, Jumping Bleed, and Night Comment are all better options than the DLC's current long-term options. The Blasphemous Blade in particular, despite the nerf, is still the easiest build in Elden Ring. Strength and Faith also allows for the most versatility and makes the game easier with a host of options. I'll leave my best Strength and Faith setup in the description below. I ran through the DLC initially with the Blasphemous Blade post-nerf, and the only boss I had major trouble with was the final boss, who I think is basically Millennia 2.0. There is no better build in my opinion than the build deemed by the community the easiest and possibly most boring. This is on New Game Plus, by the way, Journey 2 that we're taking on Rolana here. And for the Blasphemous Blade itself, it actually received a buff with a recent Talisman. The Talisman of Dread will now add damage to the Blasphemous Blade's Ash of War Taker's Flames to make the build even better. And of course, we're going to go over the new build for the Blasphemous Blade, as well as a build for Mimic with the Blasphemous Blade, and then we're going to be creating a build towards the end of this video. It ended up turning into an amazing build, by the way. You got to check that out. That's going to be awesome, and then explain my thinking process during build making. Last note here for a solo Blasphemous Blade build is, we did mention this before, but it was recently nerfed, so it's probably not going to be hit again anytime soon. However, Bloodfiend's Arm, which is broken, the perfumes, as well as the new Thorn sorcery, which does an incredible amount of bleed damage, will all likely be nerfed, making the Blasphemous Blade, in my opinion, still king. Let's jump into equipment. For the new Blasphemous Blade, we have Blasphemous Blade plus 10. We have any seal for buffs. We hit 61 poise here. You only need 51. Fire, Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander. We have the Talisman of the Dread to boost the weapon art as well. Ritual Swords Talisman, Flame tier, Faith tier 2. Let's jump into stats. And for stats on this one, we have 60 Vigor, we have 25 Mind, we have 29 Endurance, we have 22 Strength, 15 Dexterity. That's the minimum Dexterity you need, by the way, for the Blasphemous Blade itself. We have 70 Faith with the Faith tier. The Ash of War scales entirely with your Faith stat. We're using Golden Vow, of course, for the buff. We're going to explain buffs in a little bit. I'm also going to go over a list later in the video of the best new talismans, as well as the original talismans and tiers you're going to want to have to make powerful builds of your own. We're using Golden Vow here and Hellish Fury too. Alright, now in Shadow of the Erdtree, if you need a summon, it's no big deal. I'm running through on a solo run finally, and it's been going pretty well. The Blasphemous Blade is great for that, making it relatively easy. Eventually, I'll use other weapons as well and mix in different Faith things. I'm a Faith build currently. But as far as using summons, you're probably going to need them. A lot of us will for our first runs through Shadow of the Erdtree because it's very difficult. And I mentioned this in one of my other videos where I actually showed this clip and a solid Mimic setup that's going to use the Blasphemous Blade to keep Mimic healing basically constantly, do good damage, and keep him alive so he's there for the whole fight. That it's okay to use summons. There's no issue with it, especially on first runs through the game. It can be really challenging. And a lot of people are hesitant to it, and the reason for that is because their friends, the people around them, are probably telling them, solo each boss, you know, don't use a summon, this, that, whatever. If you're going to play Elden Ring a fair bit, if you're going to do a couple runs through the game, use a summon for the first run. Learn the movesets a little bit, get an idea of how the bosses work. You could always solo them on the next run. This is just my advice, my personal advice. The first time I beat Elden Ring, the first time that I ever beat the game, I used summons to get through it because it was challenging. The first run through Shadow of the Erdtree, the majority of the bosses, I use summons as well. I'm at the point now where I'm soloing most of them, of course with the Blasphemous Blade on a current run, but yeah, it gets easier after you learn some of the movesets, after you get used to the bosses a bit, and you find the right dodge windows or attack windows. And basically learn when to do whatever you can do with your current build. I mean, your build and the boss, you got to think, there's a lot to it. It depends how long the Ash of War spell or whatever you're using is, as well as the boss moveset, how fast the boss is currently. You're going to have to learn a lot there, at least for the majority of players. Same stats as before. You're giving Mimic the Blasphemous Blade, and then you could use Blessings of the Erdtree and Golden Vow on him to keep him alive. Lastly here, I'd like to show you how to make a build in Elden Ring. With the DLC out, it's now more important than ever to make the best possible builds to take on the challenging bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree. For this, we're going to show you my thought process on how to make a hybrid build with Milady. We're going to run this as a Dexterity and Faith build. The important soft caps for us are 45, 60, and 80. Since we're using the Faith here, we'll get the 60 Faith and 45 Dex. Of course, we kept 60 Vigor. I just want to point out that as far as the physical damage on the weapon, we're going to go for Keen Affinity. I'm going to show that. That's why we're going for that initial soft cap at rune level 150 for 45 Dexterity. This is without any talismans or buffs, by the way, how the build starts out. And for Faith, we've hit 60 with the Faith tier once we add that in, so we could hit that nice soft cap there and add in incantations. And that's how I want to explain the stats there. And of course, I usually go for 60 Vigor in most builds. In a second here, we're going to sit down. We're going to add in Talisman, tiers, buffs, everything you need to know to make a powerful and cool Milady build. First things first, we've got to pick an Ash of War. A perfect Ash of War for this weapon is going to be a new one, and we are going to go with Wing Stance. We're going to pick Keen Affinity because we're going for a Dexterity and Faith build. That will give us the ability for our weapon to scale basically just with Dexterity, which is perfect for us. Especially since I want to turn this into a lightning build. I think lightning would go really well with the fast style of Milady. I think that'd be a perfect combination to add in lightning here. That would be pretty cool. We're going to talk about equipment now. We have Milady with Wing Stance and Keen Affinity. I picked the Gravelstone Seal for the lightning boost, which will boost Dragon Cult incantations by 15%. For a first talisman, very straightforward. If you're using the action button for the Ash of War, the left trigger button, the Shard of Alexander will boost your weapon art by 15%. That's an easy choice. For spot number 2, we actually had 40 Dexterity on this build, but I want to hit that initial good soft cap of 45, and I also like the successive attack build up, so Millicent's Prosthesis will be the perfect talisman for this second slot. Now, this is on my second character. On my main character, I have almost all the new talismans. We're going to talk about them and a list of talismans in a little bit coming up here shortly. For the third spot here, we are going to go with the Lightning Scorpion Charm to boost lightning damage because we're building around lightning here. You do take some increased damage with these Scorpion Charms, but they are great. For whatever elemental type damage you're using, you should definitely slot them in. It's an additional 12% damage. For the number 3 spot here, since we're adding in incantations, I like the Godfrey icon. A lot of the lightning spells are chargeable. You could use Rolana's cameo, by the way, for Wing Stance if you want, but for the Godfrey icon here, it's going to be great for incantations and to add additional things to this build. And of course, a lot of the incantations in the game are chargeable, so the Godfrey icon, any of the ones that are chargeable, it's going to boost it by 15%, so solid addition there. Now, for our tiers, the first one is really straightforward. We're doing lightning damage, going for a lightning build. We're going to pick the lightning tier. We talked about the soft caps before, and we want to hit a minimum of 60 Faith for this build because we want to have a good amount of our Faith stat for those incantations. So we're going to need that Faith tier so that we get to rune level 160, essentially. That's going to give us 10 levels for 3 minutes and hit 60 Faith. We'll actually now add up to 165 if you include Millicent's Prosthesis, because that's 5 Dexterity too. Now, you can only stack 1 aura and 1 body buff. This is important to remember. Anything else will just override them. The first one here we're going to pick is Golden Vow for an additional 15% attack and defense. Now we want a body buff, but I don't want Flame Grant Me Strength because that's just good for fire damage and some physical damage. I want to generically boost all of the lightning we're using, so Howl's Reverie will generically boost our damage by 25%. Next up, I want to add on to the weapon. At 45 Dexterity, we can do a little bit better than this. We're going to pick Electrify Armament, which will give us around 200 and something additional AR and lightning damage. We're going to pick Lightning Spear for a chargeable ranged option. And then lastly, we're going to pick Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike for big target damage. All right, now in a second here, we're going to show off the build, but we've got to go over the buffing order first. Go for longest duration stuff first. Typically, tiers last around 3 minutes, a lot of them. So we're going to use our tier first, then Golden Vow, which is around 2 minutes. Then lastly, we're going to use Hellish Brewery, which is only 40 seconds. All right, you want to fill up your FP after that point, and then you're going to use Electrify Armament. You could use that last, or you could use that before Hellish Brewery. It's up to you. I like to use it afterwards because I like having that buff for a while, for the full minute duration while fighting. That's just the way I do things in terms of order, but if you want to go into the mathematical order, you could use it after Golden Vow. Wow, that was actually a huge improvement there. So much damage with the Electrify Armament. Great addition there. We're going to try this build out on the Dragons in Kaled, and we're going to put it all together. First, we're going to start with Lightning Spear for a nice ranged attack, and then we're going to go in to start using Wing Stance. Getting a lot of damage right away out of this build, and these dragons are fairly resistant. Now, I think they do take additional lightning damage, maybe 20% or so, because they are dragons after all, but the damage on the weapon, even the physical portion and stuff, we're getting a good amount of it. We're building up on successive hits. Let's see what we can do with Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike here. Now, as far as the Godfrey icon, the first strike, that initial strike, isn't boosted by the Godfrey icon, but all the additional strikes are boosted by that 15%. Pretty amazing there. We took the dragon down in a single hit. You can see there how we built around lightning, and you can build around any of the elemental damage types the same way. At least after you learn how to do stats. That's the real complicated part. Now for the great talismans here, we have the Shard of Alexander, all elemental Scorpion Charms, Ritual Swords Talisman. Now you can pause this to read all of the good talismans I use. I like in the DLC the Shattered Stone, Two-Handed Sword, Crusade Insignia, Smithing Talisman, Talisman of the Dread, Rage Divine Beast, Rolana's Cameo, Blade of Mercy, Two-Headed Turtle, and the Retaliatory Talisman, the one that you can do more damage after rolls. For the best tiers and buffs, Elemental tiers, Thorny tier, Spikecrack tier, Faith tier. For buffs, I like Golden Vow, Hellish Brewery, or Flame Grant Me Strength. Thanks for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of the best build after over 2,000 hours in Elden Ring. It's been a long journey, and DLC has brought us some amazing weapons to try out, but the base game weapons still reign supreme. With so many tried and true base game options from Jumping Bleed to the Blasphemous Blade, the DLC would have had a lot to keep up with. Which is more fun? The new stuff, of course. Plus, it's very cool to look at too, and we get some crazy Ashes of War and fighting skills. Don't forget to sub, and have an amazing day.